السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I am Professor Muhammad عطية البيومي, Professor of Pediatrics, Mansoura University. We'll be discussing today communication skills in pediatrics with a special emphasis on breaking bad news. This is going to be done on two parts, so let us start with part 1. Stay safe, look after yourselves. Coronavirus is around. What we're going to discuss today will be the basic model of communication. When do we communicate? How should we be communicating? And then we'll be given some practical example, which will be in part 2 of this lecture. Communication is an everyday practice. We do it all the time. When you're signaling for the taxi driver to stop, that's a communication. When you're buying something at the supermarket, asking for price, that's communication. So it's an everyday practice. It's a two-way process. It's not as in we define it as delivering information. It's a two-way process. We communicate all the time with verbal methods by talking, but there is also non-verbal communication with the eye contact, with the facial expression, and with the body language. There is what we call the basic model of communication, how communication is happening. There is always a sender, in this case it is yourself, who does have a message which is needed to be delivered to a receiver. The receiver is not a passive recipient. The receiver will receive the message, will process the message, and then will send a feedback, whether it's a verbal feedback or a non-verbal feedback. And this feedback should be received by the sender, processed again by the sender, and then going for more clarity of information and resending the information until we reach to the stage of acceptance by the receiver. So it's a cycle. You send, your message is received and processed by the receiver. Sometimes it's called decoded by the receiver. Then the receiver is sending feedback, whether it's a spoken or non-verbal communication. You should be listening to the verbal and non-verbal feedback, processing again the message that you've just received. You're now being the receiver, and then resending a more clear information. All this is happening within a communication environment. So, if there is a problem with any of those components of the communication model, the result will not be good. So if the sender is bad, if the message is unclear, if the receiver is not happy and is not ready to receive the message, if you cannot decode the feedback, if the environment is not suitable, it's a noisy place, it's a very hot place, it's not private. We'll come to all those components, but that's what we call the basic model of communication. For having a successful communication, then you need all those components to be working properly. So again, communication is a dialogue. Keep talking to each other, with each other. This is the good practice, is to talk with each other. It's not a monologue, it's not like you're talking to yourself. We have to stop doing that because it's actually wrong. While we're communicating, we have two important components which have to be kept in balance. What I am saying is the content, and how I am delivering this content is the technique or the process. Both have to be in very thin balance. No one of those two components should overpower the other component. Communication skill is not a test of how loud you can talk, is not a test of how much you know about the subject, is not a test of how much you can say in a given period of time. Communication skill is the skill of how to deliver the information, how to deliver the information, and how to respond to the receiver, whether the receiver is having a question, is having a concern, is unhappy, is not understanding. So that's the communication skill. So many times, my students, you are confronted within a family by some of your relatives who is not happy with the doctor he's visiting, despite this doctor being very skillful in his or her specialty. And that relative will tell you, I'm just not comfortable. He's not listening to me. I cannot get my point through. This physician is actually failing on the communication side, despite being very skillful. So your value as a physician will equal your skill times your communication skills. And it's times, is not plus, is not add. Because if some of those two components is zero, the whole equation is a zero. So you have to have your clinical skills, your clinical knowledge, plus having very good communication skills. When it comes to the communication, we've just mentioned that there is a content and the technique, the content and how you're saying what you're saying. Again, the communication is the product of multiplication. Again, because if one of those components, either the content or the technique, is a zero, the whole product is a zero. If you're the master of communication and you have no idea what you're going to talk about, clearly you're going nowhere. And the opposite is again very obvious. Stay wearing your masks around. Stay safe. Corona is still around. Protect yourself, protect your colleagues. So in medical practice, who do we communicate with? We actually communicate with everyone. It's more commonly we're communicating with the patient, with a parent, with a relative, with the child, if the child is a teenager. Many times you're the junior doctor and you're communicating with your student or with your house officer, you're communicating with your colleagues, with the manager. So we're communicating all the time in the clinical environment. But just because we're starting, we'll be focusing on communicating with the patient, and in pediatrics, we'll be communicating most of the time with the parents. Again, keep social distancing, no handshakes, keep 6 feet at least apart from everyone else to help preventing spread of the coronavirus. No handshake, no hugs, just keep the distance. I'll come back to this again, but those are some tips about the environment. We'll be discussing that again in details. Let us start now with the technique. We said that communication is a technique and a content. So if you go and read through the literature, you will find so many ways, to remember how to go through the technique. There are the 5 steps, the 8 steps, the A, B, C, D, E, and the spikes. I choose to go through the spikes, but you can do it in any way. It's not like you have to go through the technique of the spikes. They all work at the end if you master what you're doing. Spikes is short for setting, perception, invitation, knowledge, which is a major part of the technique of actually discussing the new information you'd like to discuss with the patient or the parent, and how to deal with emotions, and then you summarize and make a plan. Those are the 6 steps which are called the spikes. So let us start with the S, sitting. Where should we be conducting the communication? It has to be a quiet room, as private as possible. Everyone should have a seat. No one is sitting and one is standing and one is sitting on a table or on the edge of a bed. Of course, unless the patient is very unwell and has to be lying in bed. Have tissues available, a cup of water, and I insist this is not a joke, especially if you're going to say something really, really shocking to the patient. You have to anticipate emotions and be ready for emotion. We avoid the physical barriers, as in, it's not really good to be sitting behind your desk. You and the patient has to be in front of the desk with no physical barriers. You shouldn't be answering your phone or receiving phone calls, or someone is coming in to tell you something about another patient. So the time you're giving for this practice has to be an uninterrupted time. You ask the patient or the parent you're communicating with if they like someone else to be with them at that time. It's very important that you call everyone by their name. It's very polite to do so. It's very respectful to do so. So you ask about names. You make sure you know the child's name. Don't say your baby or your child or your son. They have a name for a reason. So use people's names. Of course, you're not going to call them by their name. You will call them by Mrs. Fulan and Mr. Fulan. The second letter in the spikes was the P. P is for the perception. What do they understand about the subject we're going to talk about? So you need to explore their prior knowledge about the condition of the child. I'll be focusing now on the parent and the child, but you can apply it to any scenario with adults or with anyone else. And then you explore the expectations. What does it mean? You have to warn them before you actually deliver the information. If someone has got a cancer, you're going to tell them that they have got a cancer, but you need to prepare them. You say something like, symptoms Hussam is having can be sometimes due to a simple infection, but in other conditions it can be due to a more serious disease. So that's a warning. You're preparing them, you're giving them the time to expect the information. The third component of the spikes is the I. I is for invitation. Invitation means you just don't come in and give them the information. You need to be invited. You need to be accepted. So you need to check whether it's a good time to talk about what you're going to talk about or not. I've got some new results on Hussam. Is it a good time to discuss it with you? Would you like me to explain it to you now? Something like that. So you need to, if you like, ask a permission, ask for an invitation to discuss the information. Then you're going for the K, you're going for the knowledge. You're going to give the information that you're going to give. You actually have to have a plan of dividing the information into small chunks, small pieces, to give them a chance to understand, and whenever you're delivering a piece of information, you go and check whether they understood this piece of information or not. And again, as we've just discussed, you use your warning shot before you're actually giving the exact news. A warning shot again can be something, as you know, we did some blood test and scan, and unfortunately the results was not as we hoped. Then you've started talking about the information now, is something serious is happening. Then you go through a pause. Don't be afraid of silence. Leave some silence, and don't talk again until you're asked about, right, doctor, so would you tell us what the results are? Or you visually see an indication that they are ready to receive the information, and then you carry on and you deliver the information. I'm sorry to tell you that Hussam has cancer. Should I say cancer? Yes, you should call the problem with its name. No going around, no attempt to make it lighter or easier or kinder. No, you just say, I'm afraid Hussam has got cancer. I'm sorry to tell you that Hussam has got cancer. Would you say, I'm sorry? Yes. I'm sorry is not an apology, is not like I've done something wrong. I'm sorry means that I'm feeling sorrow. I'm sad. I'm giving you this news. So I'm sorry is okay. Unfortunate is okay. You can use those words. You have to be talking in a slow pace, so you make sure that your information has been clearly received by the receiver. Speak clearly, slowly, with a respectful tone. Allow time for the emotions. Don't expect when you tell someone that your child has got cancer that they say, fine, that's okay. So what are we going to do? There will be some emotions coming out. So allow time for that, and then start answering questions. We'll practice how you answer questions and how you actually ask questions. After the knowledge and the phrase spikes comes the E, the emotions. It's very, very important that you recognize and respond to emotions with acceptance, with empathy and concern. Concern means that you're interested. Concern doesn't mean that you're worried. You're interested and you're accepting their feelings. Never tell them you shouldn't be feeling this way. It's a very bad thing to say. You should not be feeling sad. I am feeling sad. It doesn't help me to tell me that I shouldn't be feeling sad. You don't argue with emotions. You accept emotions. You are showing empathy with emotions. I'll come back to the difference between empathy and sympathy. And when you're responding to emotions, it's very important that while you're reassuring them is to stay true. Do not lie while you're breaking bad news. It's not kind to give false hope. Please remember this. If you're not going to take anything away from this lecture, take this sentence. It's not kind to give false hope. You're playing with emotions. Just stay true. And we'll come back to this. How to stay true and yet show hope, but a realistic hope, not a false hope. What if I'm asked a question that I don't know the answer of? Should I say I don't know? Should I just come up with a fabricated answer? Should I try to use my social intelligence to escape the question? Simply say, it's actually a very good question. I'm going to find the answer and I'll come back to you. It's okay to say, I actually don't know the answer for that. I know it's frustrating, but I promise I'll find the answer and I'll come back to you on this. And whenever you say that, you always remember to come back and tell the parent the answer. This part of emotions is extremely important, both in your practice, in your medical career, and if you're confronted in any exam, whether it's a national or an international exam. This part is a major obstacle for passing the skill of communication, is to deal with emotions. Some useful phrases while you're dealing with emotion is to say something like, well, I can see Mrs. Farag that that's not the news that you've actually expected. I'm so sorry for that. Again, sorry is okay. You can say something, I'm really sorry that it looks like it's a huge shock for you. That's empathy. That's showing that you're appreciating emotions. The last letter of the spikes was the summary and the strategy, how to close the session. You make a summary, then you check that your message has gone through, you check understanding, you tell them the plan, what's going to happen next. Then you answer any questions or concerns, and actually if they don't have questions, then you actually ask them, do you have any questions for me at that stage? Then you offer ongoing assistance, that yourself and the team will be available for further meetings if they need it. Offer them sources of further information, like leaflets, like websites, like talking to other families whom child have the same condition. That's a very good way of supporting, which is the last point on that slide, is the support. You refer them to someone who should be able to support, whether it's a social support group, whether it is the social services in your hospital, whether it is a psychological support service, but you don't leave someone to deal with the news that their child has got cancer and just walk away. You just need to give them the plan. You assure them that they do have the support. There are other sources of information if they need. Get them to talk to other families so they know their child's condition is not unique. This slide is very important. How to close that communication is not really the closure. It's the closure of this episode of communication between us, but we'll be meeting again. There will be further meeting. There will be further support. There will be further sources of information. So here we come to the end of part 1 of this lecture. We've defined the communication. We've discussed the basic model of communication, saying that it's a bidirectional process. There is a sender and the receiver who actually exchange a position. So I'm sending, then the receiver is sending me a feedback. I'm receiving the feedback, processing and resending. So it's a bidirectional flow. And we've discussed the technique of spikes. And in part 2, we'll actually be giving a practical example of how to apply the spikes in clinical settings. So that's not the end of everything. It will be continued, and thank you very much.